Hello everyone. So as Juliet said, and thank you for inviting all of us to come along this evening. My name's Kat and I'm a design historian at Kingston. I'm not an Olivetti expert, but I'm a bit obsessed with Italian design. So I think, and one of my typewriters is in the exhibition. So those things qualify me being here, I hope. But actually I get the easiest role tonight, which is that I'm just the kind of backseat driver, in a sense, chairing over the discussion between Tommaso and Fabrizio. And they have a presentation or a kind of discussion that will last about 40 minutes or so. And then we'll have a few questions amongst ourselves. Absolutely. And then immediately really open it out to the floor. It's all very informal. And then drinks afterwards. So that's it, really.
Yeah, I mean, really our objective is to start talking where we're coming from and going through
the way of the slides.
Going through, let's say, some probably less well-known aspects of the Olivetti history and legacy, and then we will jump cut to where we think a sort of Olivetti legacy and message is relevant in both the architecture and our practice today. So, just to start understanding where we are coming from, myself and Fabrizio, we co-founded a think tank which is called Factory Futures, which in the last years have been busy in terms of let's organizing design workshops, talks, and publishing some texts, which really took the Olivetti history, especially in Ivrea, as a starting point to reflect on the contemporary condition of industrial architecture and our role as architects within this realm. So let's say that our different endeavors, which are always been running in parallel to our practices, as we always focused on the polarities which distinguish the Olivettian project, which were, in summary, that's design, society, and technology, and how these three aspects can come together in different forms. So we did events, publications, and actual design workshop. These activities put together a number of partners, most notably, obviously, the Architectural Association, through which we run the visiting schools in Ivrea, the Adriano Olivetti Foundation, which is a foundation in Italy which very much focuses on the legacy of the thoughts and the projects of Olivetti, together with let's say an heritage project upon Ivrea, which has been going on for 50 years. I mean, essentially since the death of Adriano Olivetti until now, and which Ivrea is going through is a candidate for becoming a UNESCO World Heritage Site, which, interesting enough, would be the first site in Italy dedicated to modern architecture and protected by UNESCO. And together with that, we also had Gary Technologies, which is a, let's say, technology provider in terms of architecture, which stand out of the research and practice of Frank Gehry, and which supported us in the most technical aspects of the programs. All of this is centered around Ivrea, which is the blue dot on the map, and in a way networked a number of people and institutions across Europe. And this for us has always been very important also, because going around Europe, we kind of traced from Zagreb to Paris to London and obviously Milan, some of the footsteps that Olivetti himself figure out as a European network, and we use it as a reflection to the contemporary European productive landscape. I'll pass now. It's going to be a kind of
to and fro,
back to back between me and Fabrizio, but I think we really want to start from Ivrea as a place.
Yeah. So this is, let's say, a satellite image of Ivrea, which the center of which is basically here, and essentially the core of Olivetti's, let's say, production site happens along Via Iervis, which is this part of land. We'll zoom into it later. But then, of course, let's say the territory around Ivrea, which was famously known as the Canavese district, was in fact a huge part, or constituted a huge part of Olivetti's, let's say, both social and productive project. One of these, for example, poles you can see here, which is a late 60 factory in Scarmagno, designed by Marco Zanuso. If you compare it, for example, to the size of an individual house, no? You can see the scale and the impact these buildings actually had within the surrounding territory. Can I ask you?
Sure.
So as I was saying before, this is basically Ivrea's old town, and here we have let's say the first building which Camillo Olivetti had erected around, let's say, the beginning of the 20th century, so between 1900 and the 20s. And initially it wasn't even a typewriter factory. In fact, it was called CGS, which stood for centimeter gram second, and it was a factory which basically focused on highly technologically advanced measuring systems, which only later actually converted to typewriters and to producing, the products which it's famous for today. So we're talking about this building here, right? And slowly in time, somehow the site started to take the configuration which we know now, and it was really a progressive growth. The main factory consists in basically 4 extensions, the latter of which is this one, and it's 1957. And this actually is done all by, at least these 3 actually are done all by the same pair of architects, Figini Pollini, who have been working with Olivetti since the early 1930s. I'll talk about that a bit later. But Ivrea is not somehow just limited to the production unit. Of course, immediately around it we have a whole series of other buildings which we'll run through now very quickly, just so we'll have a general understanding. And these are usually buildings for which are either services for the workers, immediately attached to the factories, or also housing, for example, or community spaces, kindergartens, and whatnot. So we have to imagine this as a project which does not limit itself to a, let's say, concrete factory, but actually, let's say, has the scope of somehow transforming radically the landscape it is embedded in. And to understand the impact of that, you just have to, for example, imagine, for instance, that Ivrea, before Olivetti had started, let's say, settling there, was a village of no more than 10,000 inhabitants. By the end of the 60s, we have 30,000. So it's basically an increase in population, which is almost tripled. So here we see the original factory built by Camillo Olivetti, and then the later ones. Notably, this is the first extension, which is done by Figini Pollini, famous for the longitudinal, let's say, ribbon windows. This is actually the second. I think these are called ECO factories, and ECO is an acronym for Ingegnere Camillo Olivetti. So they take the name of the father, even though actually it's primarily under the initiative of the son, which they are being developed. And this is the second one, also designed by Figini Pollini. Both very radical in terms of the architectural proposition. This is actually one of the very earliest examples of double glazed facade with a cavity in between, where they would have had air. So you can see some of the small windows here to facilitate exchange, but we're talking about really progressive buildings which somehow made a beacon, or made let's say, a symbol of their transparency. Let's say the corporate slogan is that so that the workers could see the mountains while working and be connected somehow to the environment they actually came from. Effectively, it's embedded in a much larger discussion at a European scale around, let's say, contemporary architecture at that time. If we go to the next slide. No. So these, for instance, instead are 2 buildings, always by Figini Pollini, for the actually social services and health, sanità, I don't know how you say this in English actually. And this is the cafeteria, yeah, by Gardella, which are both in the immediate, let's say, vicinity of the factory. So we can go next. But Olivetti, not necessarily limited itself to Ivrea. Of course, we all know that there were Olivetti somehow from the 50s onwards started to, let's say, almost have an expansionist approach, whereby a large amount of factories were produced abroad. Notably, we know the examples in Pennsylvania, for example, of Louis Kahn, in Japan. Here, for instance, we see one of the first, actually, which was towards southern Italy, and this again was part of this, let's say, if you want, a socialist drive, which, let's say, intended to, at least this is again how it was campaigned, to develop what was still a South which was very much lagging behind. So here we have an instance where actually entrepreneurship moves south rather than the other way around. Notoriously in Fiat, for example, where the vast majority of laborers were actually coming from Sicily, Calabria, and Campania. So this is the factory in Pozzuoli, opened in 1955. This, for example, and designed by Luigi Cosenza. This is another factory actually in Sao Paulo, designed by Marco Zanuso. And one has to understand that to have such, let's say, highly designed and green environments around factories at the time was incredibly progressive, and it was a big statement towards what these factories represented for the company. If we go next, the company somehow used architecture for a number of different scopes. In one sense, it was somehow to push an agenda which was highly, if you want, catered towards the emancipation of the labor through, in a sense, well, let's say, high spatial qualities, but also an extremely, if you want, varied numbers of services, let's say, gravitating around the factories. This is, for example, a library in the factory in Pozzuoli, but also actually as sites for very cutting-edge experimentation with, let's say, architectural, with construction and technology. And something interesting about it is that somehow at the heart of the Olivetti project was always a very strong relation to the territory. So here, for example, we see a prototype of a module of the factory to be produced in Brazil, which famously is done with a very, let's say, thin terracotta dome. Of course, due to reasons which have to do with the extreme cost of concrete, for instance, in South America at that time, and the very actually little cost of manual labor there. So there, and of course, the capacity of the workers there to actually work with this technology and material. So if we go to the next slide. But architecture for Olivetti was not just somehow let's say, a performative aspect in the company. It was actually one of the main ways in which the company somehow constructed its global image somehow as a place of experimentation and excellence. Notably here we have one of the many magazines which Adriano Olivetti would promote within the factory, and this is mainly due to, let's say, a series of studies Olivetti does in America, where he brings back marketing strategies and ideas from the US back to Italy. And immediately on return, so after a year after he comes back, he opens the company's publicity office in Milan. This is 1928. And as somehow, let's say, one of the first, let's say, initiatives, precisely because he was aware of the importance somehow to immediately, let's say, jump on a train which had to do with campaigning really the factory as a locus of social reform and innovation. And so this is one of the earliest, if you want, of the publications, which the publications are founded from the late 30s, or actually mid-30s, up until the 60s, for example, with Zodiac. And this is Bollettino Interno, which means basically an internal bulletin. And we can see, for example, the Eco designed by Ficini Pollini, actually the earlier one and the later one, how they are being somehow, foregrounded as, if you want, symbols of the factory's excellence. This does not take place only in publications. We see also, for example, posters designed by Giovanni Pintori, for instance. These two very famous ones, where here we have basically elevations, or if you want, caricatures of elevations of all of the Olivetti factories around the world, starting from Ivrea to San Bernardo, Turin, Pozzuoli, Aquania, Barcelona, Glasgow, Buenos Aires, Sao Paulo. And again, instead here, where we see the typewriter immediately in front of the building. And there's an interesting actually discussion around the relationship between, if you want, typography at the time and let's say the actual expression of these buildings, which make, let's say, have extensive use of the grid somehow. So there is a sort of intersection there. And here, for example, this is another magazine, Technical Organization, which is actually one of the earliest ones. The cover is designed by architect Nizzoli, where really the objective was somehow to expose not only the workers' community, but also the immediate area around to some of the most cutting-edge ideas around industry and architecture globally. But somehow, I think, if you consider these magazines or this editorial project, which becomes actually a publishing house, Edizioni Comunità, as a mere, let's say, instrument to showcase is limited. Actually, through these publications, if you want, Olivetti is able to carry forth one of his main projects, which is somehow a project which occurs at a territorial scale, and which does not necessarily have to do with putting together bricks and mortar, but actually which has a pedagogical mission in educating a highly underdeveloped community and population, and accustoming them to debates which, let's say, are on the one hand social, on the one hand cultural, and on the other hand political also, around, if you want, the key role factories should have played in the economy and had played at the economy at that time. These are three examples. Comunità, of course, is the most famous one, and it starts as a magazine and becomes an actual political party. By the end of the 50s, Olivetti even becomes a member of the Senate, and I think
mayor of Ivrea.
Yeah, and also mayor of Ivrea in '56. Urbanistica is a magazine which was the magazine of the National Institute of Urbanism, of which Olivetti himself, Adriano Olivetti, was the president, and Zodiac was a magazine for basically contemporary architecture, founded in the 50s. I believe Zevi was actually this was Altieri actually who was running the magazine. And here, for instance, we see this is the factory in Pozzuoli I showed you before, in elevation, so on the magazine's cover. This, for example, is a study on the regeneration of the delta of the River Po. So if you let's say, questions which are highly catered around the territory in which these factories actually were settled. All these magazines, if you want next slide, happened concurrently to a number of initiatives around planning. And planning was one of the central activities actually which Olivetti was interested in, so much so that in 1934 he puts together a team of engineers, architects, sociologists, and whatnot to start a almost 10-year-long project for a piano regolatore. This I don't know how you translate it in English, but basically it's a master plan.
Yeah.
But it's for the Valle d'Aosta. So Valle d'Aosta is a region just north of Piedmont. But in fact, this plan did not limit itself to the juridical confines of the region. Actually, it spilled down over to Ivrea, which was in Piedmont. And somehow, let's say, it's interesting here also because of the sort of methodology of research which Olivetti, let's say, promotes and puts forward, which does not limit itself to an onlook on the individual, let's say, towns and villages, but actually tries to deal with, let's say, the whole, if you want, of the territory and the whole, a large, let's say, area, and try to understand the key, if you want, both infrastructural and architectural interventions necessary to let's say to give this area a vocation. In this case, it was famously actually a touristic vocation. So this was a plan centered around tourism, which never actually fell through, mostly because of the war. So in 1942, of course, Italy enters in war and the whole thing stops. Although the project in some way does carry forth under a different name some 10 years later.
We can see this as large feasibility studies in a way that were commissioned from the company.
Yeah, so this in fact is a 240-page document published by Edizioni Comunità itself. With the collaboration of the architects working on this, there's 3 members of the famous BBPR. So it's BBPR minus Peresutti, Figini Pollini, of course. I don't remember the other names, but maybe we can go forward. So here, for instance, we have an example of analytical methods for the village of Pila in this case, which was, let's say, a very small, very small village in Val d'Aosta. Here, for instance, we have the reality prior to the plan, and this is the church, and this is the proposition, if you want, of Olivetti, which would have included actually a second home for factory workers, co-founded actually by a housing, what do you call this?
Ida.
Yeah, no, actually it was not Ida, it was another one. But anyways, and then here, for instance, one of the charts explaining all of the kind of research which was being done on the territory, which actually included very extensive research on healthcare and the very poor condition in which stand at the time, building stock, and then all this somehow, let's say, contextualized within what was actually planning. And all these ideas are somehow highly enmeshed with the debate which was going on at the European scale. So the project actually started a year after the Athens Charter in 1933. Olivetti famously held an epistolar exchange with Le Corbusier around matters of planning, and possibly pioneered, if you want, the arrival of these ideas and actually facilitated it financially even in northern Italy. Another example here, for instance, is a plan for the village of Courmayeur, which at the moment is a very famous ski resort, but at the time was none other than a little village. I think what's interesting here is also to note the kind of graphic output and, if you want, the architectural resolution of these drawings, which in some way introduce themselves as strong gestures within the landscape. And here, notably, for example, in a similar way, the plan for Aosta itself, which was the capital, or the capital of the region, where the proposal actually was to tear down the entire village and saving only actually the buildings of Roman origin. Hence, actually, the village has also some kind of resemblance to a casta, an original Roman settlement. Yeah, here's just a zoom in, and you can see how here graphic and architecture start to enter in a dialogue somehow. So these plans somehow failed to take place, but of course, in some way, the part limited to Ivrea does start to take place in the 50s through a series of housing projects in which a number of different architects is involved. Figini Pollini actually here to only 1 or 2 buildings. Here, for example, if any of you are familiar with Talponia, which is this circular building designed by Gabetti Isola, it's right here. And then we have the workers' home, the houses for the managers, and this is another area slightly more outside of Via Iervis. So this is Via Iervis, which is the street which then takes to the factories. If you go to the next picture, actually, these are some of the photographs taken during the workshops there. Yeah. So we have 2 examples. This is the famous Talponia, which is basically an underground, if you want, housing unit made of duplex apartments, which somehow embrace a little hill. And maybe we can continue. So all these activities happened actually immediately after a moment of deep reflection for Olivetti, which was in his years in Switzerland. So Adriano Olivetti had to escape to Switzerland during the war, obviously because of his incredibly problematic relation to fascism. In fact, it was Mussolini himself actually who rejected all of the plans for Val d'Aosta, and there are signatures and sharp no's on the papers. And during those years, Olivetti writes a very important book somehow, which is published in '46, called The Political Order of Communities, L'Ordine Politico, delle Comunità, which is somewhat of a manifesto even, where Olivetti somehow puts forward if you want, an idea for a societal model which, at a very basic level, mixes ideas pertaining to socialism with a very liberal approach towards the economy. This, of course, is done actively on the territory by Olivetti himself through speeches and campaigns. And somehow in these years, so in the 50s, we also have a whole series of projects which are being built around the factory which engage directly with the territory and its community. So, for instance, there is a number of different projects catered towards childcare and schools, training facilities for unskilled laborers, which will have to take exams to then have a certificate, which will allow them to work in the factories. And this is one example, but there was a vast number of them in the surrounding region, and a whole series of community projects such as libraries and recreational centers and whatnot. So if we go to the next slide, this leads to the foundation in the 50s of the IRUR, which is actually probably a less known Olivettian organization. And it's the Institute for the Renewal of Urban and Rural, Institute for Urban and Rural Renewal, which somehow, let's say, really kind of locks this idea or this approach Olivetti was trying to entertain with the surrounding territory, where, in a sense, the glass walls of the factory are shattered, and really there starts to be an osmotic process between local communities and the factories themselves. This took place via the support and formation of actually distributed production facilities at a smaller scale. So, for example, in the textile industry, in the leather industry, but also, let's say, a very, if you want, aggressive involvement within policy. And so this organization actually actively proposed itself, not just as a consultant to local municipalities to increase, let's say, or here you see, contribute to the problem of full employment and workforce, but actually even fostered programs, let's say, of its own to tackle it forthrightly.
And it was also born out of a struggle that was happening at the time, which was, the increasing development of mass production and the struggle of, reconciliating mass production with a rural setting. And interesting enough, this was a period in which Adriano Olivetti was excluded from the board of Olivetti itself and dedicated itself to specifically this project.
Yes. This somehow also translates in a certain shift within the nature of the production facilities being designed and planned by Olivetti itself. Suddenly we have models which are no longer, let's say, enmeshed within the urban tissue of Ivrea, but which for matters of scale and convenience are located externally to Ivrea, even within, let's say, the same, let's say, productive region. Notably the case of Scarmagno, for instance, which is the one I showed you before on the satellite view. So we're talking about plants of enormous dimension, where, let's say, if you want, on the one hand, the challenges arriving from the introduction of electronics completely changes the nature of the production cycle. but also somehow the fluctuating demands of the market some call for an entirely new type of production facilities, which is more flexible, repurposable, and where, let's say, which is in actual fact infinitely extendable even. So if we go to the next slide, somehow it's interesting how there is a parallel going forth between the company trying to distribute itself within the landscape, and at the same time, at an architectural resolution, these factories, let's say, developing as, if you want, a three-dimensional rendition of a spreadsheet, which, let's say, obeys to a module which can be in some way extended and phased according to the demands of the market. And this actually is an interesting resolution within the actual details in which of how the factory is built. Here, for instance, is one of the end columns where a space is always left blank for the next beam to come in, even when actually the facades are placed on. And here, I think within this drawing, somehow what's interesting is that we somehow sense another and probably the most important aspect of Olivetti's project, which was, in a sense, the collaborative nature of it and the interdisciplinarity. And here we have actually some of the most avant-garde and progressive experiments of integration of services within architectural structures, which is a failed project, but because we all know that actually flexibility demands exposure of services and not their integration within structure. But actually, let's say, if you want showcased an ethos, a working ethos, which took place at a territorial scale, but also at the scale of an architectural component. Yeah. So here, for example, we have a view of one of these factories inside with the production line, and at the same time, in the next drawing, we see how, let's say, diagrams of the building actually, and drawings and plans in particular, start to highlight, if you want, the organizational qualities and the management of fluxes within these buildings much more than, if you want, a more conventional distribution of volumes and programs. So here, for instance, we see the path of a worker which goes through changing rooms, and then the whole space being designed according to the, let's say, the technicalities of the project, the circulation and the production line. And these, for example, are the canteens and the services which are all, let's say, ancillary to these main production spaces.
Yeah, and interestingly enough, this is also where we started our design and more experimental exercises with the students. I mean, we thought that this was in a way the Olivettian project where the most contemporary aspect of its legacy could then reflect into contemporary design in terms of flows, fluxes, and something which is increasingly less related to purely architectural form. And so if we now jump cut to a second part of the presentation, in which we essentially jump cut 50 years from this point in time to today, where we can now quite firmly state that we are moving from an economy based on the networking of human intelligence, which has essentially been the critical point of the last 50 years of production, from that moment in time to essentially today's knowledge economy that we probably know very well, to a point in which there is a new economy, which we know being increasingly based on the networking of machine intelligence. And through the workshop, we actually questioned that. And we are saying, maybe a certain contemporary discourse around, a flexible workplace and sharing economy, about knowledge, etc., is probably something that we can move on from it. And in terms of let's say in an Olivettian term, we could say, if this was tired in a way, what is wired today is a much different sort of ecology, where just not only humans are interacting, but humans are increasingly interacting with machines, and machines within themselves in the world of contemporary production. So our question in Ivrea was, how do we reconcile an Olivetian legacy and a certain kind of humanism with a productive landscape which has dramatically changed and is composed by infrastructures, networks, artificial intelligences, and computing power. So just to give you some we think interesting facts about what have been considered by the World Economic Forum the drivers of change in the next let's say wave of productive activities. We see that in a way cloud technologies, processing powers, and new energy supplies are possibly the key drivers of change. And our question then, specifically on industrial architecture and how we can respond to today's parameters, came into being. And we are actually very interested in scale and looking at what is, and asking ourselves what is cutting edge today. I mean, is it still the workplace as we initially considered, or is actually new forms of production? And this is an interesting diagram showing the relationship of scale between very famous archetypal buildings throughout human history and actually the largest production facility now planned on the globe, which is the Tesla Gigafactory in Reno. And with the students we were thinking there is something that as architects I think we are missing in terms of our ability to understand and to operate within a realm which is changing dramatically, not only in terms of its geography and scale, but first and foremost in its relationship with the territory. And here we go back to some of the aspects that we think were very forward-looking, at the same time have been often not very well investigated of the Olivetian project, which is possibly more famous for its objects rather than its large will of understanding the territory and implementing an industrial architecture within it. So, we've got advanced manufacturing, we've got data. This is a Facebook data center in North America. We've got knowledge/production facilities which are taking the scale and a sort of level of representation within large landscape. And this is the building site of the new Apple headquarters. Until talking about energy, we are seeing increasingly very large projects both globally and in the UK about old and new forms of energy. This is a nuclear power plant in China, which is being built right now, and which we can understand the scale through satellite images, which become, I think, connecting also to what Fabrizio was saying before, the understanding of a new perception of infrastructure and possibly a new perspective given by, very straightforward things in our life, which is essentially the possibility of accessing satellite images and aerial views. And this for us, in a way, opened up the question of what is the relevance today of industrial architecture, especially in a world in which to define as an architect the architectural object at the scale, it becomes increasingly more problematic because of its procurement routes and because of its especially because of the distribution of the design team and the client body. And we see in a way in this global view of global infrastructure an opportunity. Now, as part of our, let's say, Olivetian legacy, we're asking ourselves how we can operate within this realm, and we think that, in a way, obviously, networked intelligence or collective intelligence in the design world are possibly, the only way to be able to have an agency within this realm. So, from Factory Futures, we started spreading knowledge and workshops across organization in Europe. And we've also been asking, given that the Olivettian or the illuminated entrepreneur is something which is, is difficult to find, to say at least. We've been asking, who are the players of today's industrial architecture, if we want to call it that. So we have a plethora of very specialized people to which you have to start, talking their lingo if you want to have a meaningful discussion and start, interacting with this world, which I think that, we can clearly say that has been very much been, I wouldn't say hijacked, but in a way has been taken off the responsibilities of the architect towards a mostly engineering mission. And what we want to say with this is that I think we need, in a very Olivettian terms, we have to go back to an understanding of what is the current situation of the productive environment and where we can be effective on that. So also in terms of our practice, which was born out of Factory Futures and now has different outputs. If we look, for example, at the UK, we see completely new territories emerging. This is an interesting diagram which essentially shows what is called the Cambridge Stansted London corridor or tech corridor, and probably you're all familiar with projects across London, going from the Silicon Roundabout to Tech City in Hackney, towards the Stansted corridor, and Cambridge as obviously a research and knowledge center in this territory. And we are asking ourselves, and this is going to be also part of our next project that myself and Fabrizio are going to look at for the Bauhaus Institute, is going to be, how can we operate, how can we map, and how we can understand the demographics and the societal impact of such a project, and what kind of responses can we give as architects and designers. Another interesting area that we are looking more in terms of the practice that I personally am working on with is the Cambria Energy Coast. So this is another massive infrastructural project which is obviously going on for many years. You probably know the Sellafield site. It's been the first nuclear site in the UK, and a project that we're working on right now, which is next to it, which is a large nuclear project which will provide 7% of the energy demands of the UK. And I think that in our thinking there has always been an idea of how to intervene within the territory and what kind of an architecture can signify today within this realm. This is like the latest image that we produce for the nuclear site as Scott Browning, as the advanced technologies sector that we are working with. And I guess this is a bet in a way in terms of what we can show and what also we can discuss today. In a way, is how do we intervene within a territory? What is the role of architecture, and where can a certain idea of representation and in a way maybe even symbolism or abstraction in this case can reemerge within the contemporary productive landscape. And so going back to Olivetti, this is an elevation that we always find quite interesting because it puts this completely artificial horizon of the factory as a new element in the landscape, which deals with in this case very poetically with this rising sun. But there is a progressive idea within that talking about the legacy of Olivetti. I think that from our first endeavors in Ivrea, we still embrace, and we are still trying to to figure out how to bring back certain parameters within the contemporary practice, and what are the new forms of architecture which can emerge out of this realm. And going back to this idea of how you, or the new perception of the world, we found very interesting. For example, like there is this very late, very new project from Cristo, who's been an artist very much involved in territorial, at the territorial scale, and this is a new kind of walkway on the Lake Iseo in Italy, and which actually recovers an idea of symbolism and of figuration at a territorial scale. So our question is, could this be a new direction for an industrial architecture? Could this be a new direction where we can, in a way, reconnect a certain human experience with infrastructure? Which again, I think it's a problem which is very much contemporary. So we are actually quite interested in this idea of man-made large-scale interventions, and this is a Richard Serra installation in the desert of Qatar. And to possibly finish this, we just want to show a video, which is this one, which we think it may reassume the contemporary condition. Okay.
Thank you both. Goodness, Fabrizio, that was a really in-depth and insightful presentation on Olivetti in a way that lots of that was new to me actually, but then a really interesting connection from talking about showing this very particular approach to production architecture and how that's relevant today through the work that you're doing, and the ways that the changes to what we make and how we make, and how that for all the kind of the implications of that aren't really, those connections aren't really being made in that sense, I think. So in all the things that I get to ask the first couple of questions, I guess, I mean, you suggested that you use the word certain parameters, and I think I was intrigued. Clearly Olivetti has been set up. You set up this big kind of example of Olivetti and all the things that they were doing to think about their workers, to think about their relationship with the community, with the territory. What are, even at an early stage, are some of the lessons, both inspirations but also cautionary tales, that you think you could take from what Olivetti was doing in Ivrea to what we were doing today, or what we could be doing today?
Yeah, well, definitely so. So if I, Olivetti is in a way a failed experiment historically, and we have to acknowledge that. It's an experiment that didn't find for many reasons its prosecution within the Italian territory, especially at a communitarian level, or let's say it's the principles of his communitarian project. So and I think that and I think that we showed that the example of this Carmagno factory as that struggle that those ideas were facing when put in front the ruthless company and corporate needs which were emerging at a time of mass production, and how you could link that within a territorial project which started at a completely different scale. And the question then became even more problematic in the time in which Adriano Olivetti dies and the company starts to lose let's say a central focus of direction, and it starts to be in a way dismantled into a financial operation, like many production companies are led today, or many the forces of production are essentially devised. So to answer your question, I think that we have to go back to a very pragmatic understanding of what is happening today, and that's I'm telling it from my architectural standpoint, and we have to, I think, understand where not by chance we've shown these certain drivers of change, and we have to face, I think, today, what are the implications of automation, what are the implications of machine intelligence against the reality of our jobs. We all know, we can all acknowledge that we are going through a period of essentially jobless growth, and this is what we, on an everyday practice, we face by talking with municipalities, because we can propose in the Cambridge corridor a large development which consists of, let's say, data centers, but the issue that we're facing there is obviously the one of saying, well, the municipality needs to grow jobs, and then finally the question becomes, okay, how do you reconcile that with a sense of community, or with an interface between humans and a completely and very rapidly changing scenario of production. So I think that Olivetti in all of this was an idealist, but he was always been an opportunist at the same time. So and overcame from his own practice a number of political ideologies, because he's essentially had to found his very own to implement this project.
I think also what's interesting there is that somehow there is a concurrence between let's say all these initiatives Olivetti starts within the surrounding landscape and the changing actually context which the company somehow is situated in terms of its supply and demand chains. So in some way, let's say, Ivrea has always been a center, but has also always been marginalized. And to a certain extent, this desperate attempt to reform the world around so that the factory could endure is, to some extent, also the result of an incapacity to actually create a place in which, let's say, radical innovation also occurs at the level of the products produced. And notably, the company starts to fail when they start to actually invest on, very early computers, for instance. So I think the question of synergy is important, and possibly in these diagrams which Tommaso was showing of the Cambridge corridor, and even at a smaller scale, in London at the level of the Silicon Roundabout, I think a central question is also that of subjectivity somehow, and how, let's say, a certain idea of production, certain strategies let's say, engage with cultural issues and if you want, the concerns of a certain place. So that is kind of that is a challenge, but that is also, I think, let's say, one place in which architects still have, let's say, the capacity to act in.
That changed role is interesting, I think, of architects as well as industrialists, because I think, and this is maybe a provocation as much as a question, you know, the idea, should we or could there be an Olivetti and all these collaborations with Virginia Paulini and all these architects again? And I say that partly because, you know, after a while of everything you're talking about what Olivetti was doing, I kind of got the sense he was a bit of a megalomaniac, to be honest. I mean, this idea of control, that actually you could kind of top down, going to master plan the lives of these people with a faith and a confidence in his role as an intellectual, you know, in that particular time in Italy. And similarly, architects, and still with a kind of neo-rationalist idea of a faith in their idea of the future and what it could be like. And if I think today, and as you say, that the role of the architect has kind of shrunk to a tiny degree in that process, that it seems partly impossible. But then also I think of companies like Google, and it makes me cold inside when I think about their attempts at kind of controlling and shaping the lives of workers. So I wonder if that's, I don't know where that goes, but as a question about also a relationship with these kind of companies.
I mean, the key issue with Olivetti, which is, let's say, fundamental to understanding, let's say, if you want, the innovation, but also the proposition, was planning, and planning was a central aspect somehow of the whole of the Olivettian project, and I guess that is what I think today becomes more, let's say, more complex because of the sheer numbers of players involved and other issues. But somehow it's planning is, I think, still the key.
Yeah, it is a key factor, and the other key factor. I think it relates very well to some of the slides that you've shown. I mean, for example, the Aosta plan or other plans that. Okay, it's incredible. When you go to Ivrea and you go through the archives of Olivetti, there are essentially mountains of documents of studies on demographics, social impacts, things that you would you could barely say that belonging to the 60s, and I think it's really in a way that is missing today. It's like it's the briefing stage. It's the kind of thorough understanding of a territory and a thorough research on territories and how they can come together in a different way, for a very simple reason that being planning or at least development driven by either real estate forces or let's say very risk adverse organizations, and given that in a way the planning system itself is in a way lacking, I think, a thorough understanding, a thorough research on the from the corporate side on the territory. I think that's in a way being an architect. Sometimes the problem that you face is that the briefs are very much all the same. And the interesting thing about Olivetti is that he was the one who was creating that difference in the first place by bringing into the briefing stage a lot of different forces from artists to architects to urbanists to economists, etc., etc., etc. So I think that the opportunity today is really to start also from the architectural point of view, to start from the very beginning of the project, or to try to insert yourself within the dynamics which are, in a way, before the project. Because again, I think that what we are lacking now, or probably I am lacking, but is an understanding of where of exactly what is happening. I think that the world changes at a pace which is incredibly difficult to grasp without without the tools and the research that is often needed. So Olivetti was great for that. I mean, he was a great strategist, I think.
Yeah. So my last question for working out to the floor, we talked about the importance therefore of planning and having also people who can set those briefs, thinking about this production architecture today and policies. So if Olivetti was Olivetti's Cambridge corridor or Olivetti's Reno factory, how different would it look, and what would he make sure was there?
That's an interesting question. I mean, we asked ourselves, sometimes in Ivrea, I mean, what would be happening if Olivetti was here today? Well, it's it's a good question. I personally never figured out. Did you?
I don't think it's context has changed, and many things have happened. Meanwhile, Olivetti is not today, is not here today.
Yeah, but
but at the same time, you still have figures which are, let's say, present themselves as enlightened entrepreneurs, which supposedly want to create an intersection of different types of practices. Apple is a clear example of that, where design, architecture, and innovation somehow converge within, let's say, a highly sophisticated brand. But I think it's hard to even make a comparison. We know at what scale and in what way, let's say, Apple's production cycles occur, and we know how there are certain frictions where if you want to be a global player nowadays, as Olivetti was, I guess, in the 60s, you have to engage with because of competition and whatnot. And so,
in a way, we go back to the question of scale as well. So, I mean, we could definitely, imagine, an illuminated entrepreneur who has like a genuine care about design, etc. So, I could think about many examples, also in Britain, etc. But the question is, what happens at, on the other side, the scale from Olivetti was at the 60s to the scale in which certain infrastructures and development are running today is dramatically changed. So he was talking about, a regional and maximum a national strategy, which was already at that time, very innovative. Today, you're facing a completely globalized system. So the question again, going back to the slide in which we were laying out, key players in this world, which are not individuals often, are very large and complex organizations. So I think that's the game changer, and I think that in a way there is a duty of care, of understanding, how you can operate within that realm, which is a different one from, let's say, a direct commission of of an architect for a building. You're talking about a systemic way to approach an industry.
And also, like, obviously we talk from the standpoint of architects, and that's a completely different question. So for us, I guess the more interesting question is actually how do you make yourself available or find an agency, or how can you take part within that cycle? How can you introduce yourself within that cycle? And I think the question of the brief is a very important one. And Tommaso, I guess, deals with this daily, no?
Yeah, but it is. I think it's you can also easily question the role of the architect and the role of design today. I mean, whether you get to a scale in which you actually question the relevance of design to certain extent, or the traditional idea of design, which goes down to the level of the object or to the level of a building. We think that there is another. Well, I personally think that there is another horizon to the discipline, which goes much more, let's say, towards planning and towards a large scale briefing and policy making.
Yeah, which I think is starting to
from
happen.
the level of the architect.
Yeah.
Well, the interesting thing is that all these projects somehow, in one way or another, let's say, have a sheer impact, which in some way will force and is forcing certain changes at the level of policy to occur. So the question, I guess, is whether one on our side of the spectrum is conscious of it, and in what way actually can one start to articulate these relations in an interesting way, or in a way which is compelling, socially compelling.
I guess you want to make sure that role is positive and rather than just reacting to a kind of change coming in. Do we have any questions? Yes.
When you say that Olivetti was a failed experiment, I wasn't quite sure in what sense you meant that. Was it because Olivetti itself failed as a company?
Well, no, I mean that can happen in a way. Companies are made and they end up. I'm just talking, maybe I don't know. That's the nostalgic part about about me. But systemically, there has been a crucial moment in Italy where the money of the Marshall Plan and the American money which was flowing in Italy should have either be directed within the automotive industry or within a company which was promoting intellectual property, design, and electronics. So and the other one is Fiat in a way, and the automobile industry. So in hindsight, well, that wasn't a success because in Italy we lost that, and we lost that sort of industry which was there, and so we are left with a kind of half American automobile company which produces less and less cars in Italy, and that jeopardized large parts of the northern Italian territory. So that for me is a problem.
At the same time, most of the factories in Italy nowadays are actually headquarters of telecommunication, or not headquarters, actually are outposts of telecommunication companies. So in fact, in Ivrea you have it's mostly call centers, for example, for Vodafone, and
in those buildings.
In those very buildings, yeah.
What about the kind of the social aspect, which is wet schools and the health? I mean, that's.
Well,
that
even
after all goes, we had things like that in 19th century England, but I don't think Apple, for instance, does that.
No, exactly. So that is a very interesting proposition.
Yeah.
One should question, what is the ethos, or what is the reasoning behind those types of initiatives. And we were saying before with Tommaso actually that there is a whole, let's say, generation of people still in Ivrea which are highly actually opposed to the Olivettian project. So even old people, which actually talk very negatively about Olivetti and the impact it has had on the communities and the landscape, and that somehow it has. Let's say, if you want, rather than consolidating, let's say, local tradition, it has dismantled and, let's say, emancipated in the most negative aspect of the term, what was a landscape which perhaps was not, let's say, competitive, but had its own equilibrium somehow.
Well, you can compare that, talking about, models. I mean, if you compare Ivrea to the Silicon Valley, for example, I mean, you're talking about two very different systems. In a way, the Silicon Valley has been always a much more distributed system of production and intellectual, let's say, property generation, and it proved itself to be a much more resilient, model. Let's say, starting from the 70s until now. There are many caveats to this statement, but there is only one reality in a way in Ivrea, and it is the lack of Olivetti is the key aspect of that place, whether it's not being replaceable, whether it's obviously like a statewide systematic dismantling of that model. Well, that's another matter, but yeah, I don't think that in Ivrea nobody can really talk about Olivetti as a finally
successful
experiment. I mean, it's sad to say. Then on the other side you have a model which has been very much the beginning of a lot of practices. I mean, if you enter into a Googleplex in Mountain View, you can see possibly things which were kind of already there in a different way.
And
yes, the legacy,
in a different configuration.
Yeah, but this is an interesting point. It's like what to take of the Olivetti lesson.
But definitely you have companies nowadays, such as Google, for example, which in a sense encroach on, it's probably more than facilitating the life of their employees, actually try to make of work a totalizing experience somehow.
I was just thinking about that there is an interesting parallel and at the same time an interesting contrast between, what was the interest of Olivetti as a person and as an entrepreneur into engaging his workforce with social services. Evidently, I think it was like if he found it advantageous to make his workers to identify with the company.
Of course, Olivetti famously, Olivetti spends famously six months or even more in the U.S. actually studying closely Ford's factories, the Ford model.
But it's a Ford model plus, no?
But the plus, for example, imagine that it's very different, for example, from the context of Fiat. Imagine you have a company which slowly doubles the population of a village, which in no way has the infrastructure necessary to accommodate that labor force. This is it comes out of a necessity, and then I kind of, let's say, I can imagine that it is a necessity to provide this infrastructure from the company, because who is going to do it? The municipality? Absolutely not. And the only way in which somehow you can cater growth is if you take on your own initiative these kind of projects. And so in a sense it is about changing the world. It was about changing the context around to accommodate.
As a payback he was getting
on the other side, for example, there are very important and unprecedented and incredibly innovative things about the company. For example, the difference in the salary between the relation in salary between a director and a worker was 1 to 5, and at the moment in Fiat it's 1 to 460, for example. And those are things which are significant, and one can question whether they're part of a larger scheme, which has to do with, let's say, creating a serendipitous working environment for innovation to change, which is at the heart of every, let's say, company nowadays. We see this rhetoric from the BMW buildings in Leipzig, for example, famously the new Zaadid central building, which in a sense tries to create a visual and a physical encounter between the worker force within the production chains and instead the white collars in the offices, so the people that actually manage the factories. And it's as part of this rhetoric somehow of transparency and sociability. But obviously there are ratios which are unmatched, and also certain advantages which the workers had back then, which are unprecedented.
And let's not forget, I mean, that was 68 we're talking about, where
No, it was a bit earlier.
No, but especially during 68, I mean, Olivetti was essentially the only factory which was, working with open gates in Italy, while the other ones were, you had actually workers, locking out the gates. So that was also, we shouldn't ever. I mean, it's quite easy to compare Olivetti to today's forms of production. The reality is that he was an incredibly original and unique being within the Italian context specifically.
Was there an element of socialist idealism as well as a big capitalist drive?
Yeah. It was also related to the religious conviction of Adriano Olivetti. It was like a.
But also, everyone started as a socialist in the 30s.
What's interesting though is that it probably straddles the difference between private and public capital, because in the first industrial country, UK, you have Robert Owen in the 19th century creating your ladder. So this is another unique experiment.
Yeah.
Then you have Cadbury, and then you have the schism after the mass production of the Crystal Palace of the anti-urban view, which is the Garden City movement. So people reacting to industrialization. But at the same time, in the second wave of industrialization, Italy and France, you see the Marinetti and futurists, and then you get out of that comes Olivetti. So it's partly tied to which wave you're in, but it's also the difference between privately held capital and then globalized capital with shareholdings, because obviously Apple are driven by a totally different ownership base than something like Olivetti was in 1910, and of course the drive there at that time would be quite different. So it's kind of interesting to compare, as the speaker said earlier, at this mega scale where you don't really have a meta market, I would say, then the drivers are quite different as to what the physical what's the provenance of production. Apple just, MIT just published a study that says that you can build everything but an Apple iPhone in America, but it will cost $100. So it's a bit like, where do you want to have that made? If it's a Valentino, do you want to be in Italy, or do you want to be in Vietnam?
And those things are even more complex now because of the kind of settlements of Chinese producers in Italy.
I mean, it's interesting how we got to the problems argument cheese has got to.
Also, I should say one thing we haven't mentioned is that the idea of industrialists producing magazines and having a vision for cultural society wasn't unusual in Italy. So Cassina, Cartel, even examples of publishers like Franzolini, they were all understood that they had a kind of a political voice. They had a voice in society, and they weren't just there to publish books or make plastic chairs. They were also kind of had this bigger, that's why this kind of intellectual faith in a project, I guess, that was more than just production.
Yeah.
In a sense, or understood the cultural implications and responsibilities of production.
It was an episode of history where design actually could go much deeper than probably can do now. This actually was, I think, Tommaso's question on how can I, as an architect, be very effective in this process? Because we all have the feeling there is not just the matter of how I design the windows or the structure of the building. I think it was an interesting lesson in the Italian school and research about architecture in that period. That everybody was convinced that they had the power to go very deep into society.
So actually one of the earlier drawings that you showed were some of the plans, I think the Paradosta, the kind of colourful plans. They reminded me of the kind of the parody drawings of Archizoom from the 60s and 70s, and actually that undermining of all that idea that architects had any control, and that it was a good thing that they were trying to have these kind of visions of society where you would sort of ignore the validness nature of what you're doing.
I mean, obviously, even for example, the first map I showed, which had all the viabilità, so the road infrastructure, in the current political state it would not even be a discussion for a question of impact and the way in which the communities would react to it. So it is not even it would not, and it was not even back then, but it would not even be near a possibility to discuss. Like, these are regions where we are still negotiating a tunnel, which goes from Porto to St. Petersburg, and still, still the friction is taking place there, precisely because these people actually do not want to be emancipated and do not want to be integrated within a broader productive cycle somehow.
Yes, which goes back to the possibility of relating to that. So this again, we go back, I think, to a key question. How communities do relate with the territories produced by contemporary global forces. I mean, this is I think it's a key question today, and we found on this on this mega satellite views, in a way, a kind of idea of monumentality that sort of reemerges strangely at the scale of the territory, and in a way, I mean, you mentioned obviously, certain experiments, certain radical experiments of the 60s and 70s in Italy that, in a completely different way, but were already, imagining this situation. So, I think that the opportunity is coming to terms for us to at least try to have an agency within these processes.
It seems like the idea of agency seems a good, positive message to end on. If anybody has any burning questions. Yes.
I had a question about, thought about, I think there's really going to be an interest for these companies to engage with these kind of other social programs when the new functions that these massive factories are for, like data centers and nuclear power stations, they're not very, they're not very people intensive, so that interest just isn't there because it isn't sort of very symbiotic. They're not much less than social programs when they are reliant on human capital.
I agree, but I think that's the conundrum of our situation. We have a political class and a society which effectively is linked to to an idea of job counts, which doesn't match the reality or certain realities of production. So something has to happen in there. I don't have the answer, but there is you're highlighting what is a problem that we are facing every day. We are facing with each planning application that you put in, and I'm not saying a kind of jobless society, sort of dystopia is good. I mean, far from my thinking, but at the same time, there is a burning question that we, and especially nobody in the political class, is able to possibly put forward a different model, and you're right. At a certain point, either I don't know, somebody has to come up with an idea there, because it is true.
What kind of ethics are involved when there are no workers in that kind of production architecture?
Yeah, I mean that's it would go for a whole other symposium. That's we are not even possibly but I think that the question goes back to a very matter of fact daily activity of the architect today, and I think that we face that, and we are there to to give an environmental and social response to this situation. Now, which one it is exactly, I don't know, but it's an open question.
Well, on that more questioning attitude, I think we will thank you both for a very stimulating discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.